This is the first episode of Female Criminals, covering the cannibal cook, Katherine Knight. She worked at a slaughterhouse and one day decided to hone her skills at home.
Due to the graphic nature of this episode, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussions of violence, sex, domestic abuse, and animal cruelty that some people may find offensive. We advise extreme caution for children under the age of 13. There are some crimes so heinous that they become the stuff of legend, stories told to neighbors over cups of coffee, or whispered in hushed tones between classes at school. These atrocities can define a place, like the Belangolo State Forest, where serial killer Ivan Milat murdered 7 unsuspecting backpackers, then buried their bodies in the dense scrub. Or like the small hamlet of Snowtown, where an abandoned bank vault became the hiding place for 8 dismembered bodies who were tortured and killed by a twisted gang. Both of these stories have come to define parts of Australia. Everyone in the island nation seems to know the significance, and the crime we're discussing today is also from Australia and is perhaps even more gruesome than those. But at its center is a woman, and most people have probably never heard of her. But after this, you'll never forget the name, Katherine Knight. Welcome to Female Criminals, a Spotify original from Parcast. I'm your host, Vanessa Richardson, and this story is about the life and horrific crime of one woman in small-town Australia. Today, we'll delve into Katherine Knight's long history of domestic abuse, which lay the groundwork for a spine-chilling act of violence. Next week, we'll look at the lead-up to Katherine's bloody crime and how it earned her a dubious honor among Australia's female criminals. We've got all that and more coming up. Stay with us. When describing the most remote corners of the world, the term far-flung is often used to indicate just how far away a destination is. Hundreds of miles stand between these locales and their nearest neighbors, far from civilization, far from the hustle and bustle of the nearest city, far from anything. The small Australian town of Aberdeen seems to fit that mold. 85 miles from the nearest city of Newcastle, and not really big enough to offer much interest for passing tourists, nor is there a whole lot for the people who live there. The town, located in the depths of the region's mining belt, has a few minor claims to fame. The Aberdeen Tigers Rugby Club have won 24 premierships in a local competition since 1897. It's also the birthplace of the Australian cattle dog, or so a sign boasts. A larger neighboring town also claims the breed as its own, which significantly lessens Aberdeen's ownership of the factoid. As far as famous or influential people who have called the tiny township home, there's typically only one name on the list, Katherine Knight. And hers is a name that the locals would likely prefer to forget, for it brought a level of attention to Aberdeen that it hadn't seen since, well, ever. When Katherine and her twin sister Joy were born in October of 1955, the town was mostly known for its abattoir. For a long time, the gruesome factory work was one of the few job prospects on offer in Aberdeen, so it's little surprise that most members of the Knight family seemed destined to work at the slaughterhouse. Of course, before she could join the family vocation, Katherine had to make it through a turbulent childhood. Her relatives were, by many accounts, somewhat infamous around those parts. As Katherine's half-brother Bobby put it, the family is rotten to the core. If there's any truth to that idea, the decay went all the way to the head of the family. Katherine told psychiatrists that her father, Ken, used to demand sex from his wife, Barbara, whenever he felt like it, even going so far as to chase her through the house. But this wasn't the playful cat and mouse of a primetime sitcom couple. Katherine said Ken would beat Barbara, sometimes knocking her out, so he could rape her. Even when the children were at home, all 8 of them, Ken carried on as he saw fit, Nothing was going to stop him getting what he wanted, what he felt he deserved. As she grew up, Katherine regularly heard complaints from her long-suffering mother about the violence of men, about her husband's abuse. But Barbara never left. She stayed, enduring in her horrific marriage for decades. But though Barbara clearly suffered at the hands of her husband, she was by no means a blameless parent. She ran a tight ship and insisted that each of her children pulled their weight. Katherine and her siblings were expected to make their beds each morning, and it had to be perfect. Barbara wanted the sheets tucked so tightly that she could literally bounce a coin off of them. If she wasn't satisfied, she'd pull the sheets off the bed and order the kid to start again. And although she protected them from her husband's abuse, Barbara also used corporal punishment on her children. Unfortunately, that likely wasn't the only abuse Katherine experienced in her home. Though psychiatrists differed in whether they believed the stories, Katherine later claimed that her older brothers sexually abused her as a young girl. As far as we can tell, Kath never shared specifics of the abuse, but if her claims are true, then they might account for her childhood fear of the dark. As a result, Katherine carried a treasured doll around the house, believing it would protect her from things hidden in the shadows, and perhaps from her own family members. And the young girl wasn't alone in her fear of the Knight family home. Years later, neighbors noted that the atmosphere in the house was uncomfortable at best. They said it smelled of violence. And while it seems unlikely that there was a literal scent of violence in the air, it might be that visitors to the house picked up on something else. According to Peter Lawler's book, Bloodstain, Barbara used to tell people that there was a madness running through the women in her family. Unfortunately, there's little other information that might explain exactly what she meant by that. But whatever the case, it's clear that at least one of her children inherited some undesirable qualities. Before we continue with Katherine's psychology, please keep in mind that I'm not a licensed psychiatrist or psychologist, but we have done a lot of research for the show. When Katherine was an adult, 2 psychiatrists diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, which the Australian BPD Foundation describes as a complex, often misunderstood mental disorder. This diagnosis is something we should keep in mind throughout Katherine's story as we trace her erratic, sometimes disturbing behavior. The condition can make it difficult for people to feel safe in their relationships with other people, to have healthy thoughts and beliefs about themselves, and to control their emotions and impulses. Interestingly, women are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with BPD than men. And crucially, BPD symptoms typically first appear in teenagehood or early adulthood, though what triggers the condition is less certain. It's thought that biological factors may play a role alongside social and environmental factors like childhood trauma and abuse. With that information in mind, Katherine's behavior for the rest of her life seems to make more sense. And as Kath got older, her nasty temper grew with her. As a teenager, she sometimes had to be held back when she flew into a rage to stop her from doing serious damage to whoever or whatever set her off. For this reason, and for her bullying nature, other kids at school learned to give her a wide berth. But Katherine's wrath was hard to avoid, and she was frequently seen fighting other kids in the schoolyard, sometimes with her twin sister Joy by her side to back her up. Other times, Joy was the person she fought, each teenage girl throwing punches with surprising ferocity. It might not shock you to learn that school wasn't Katherine's bag, and she left sometime around 1970. Somehow she'd flown under the radar in the classroom, and even though she was 15, Katherine could neither read nor write. She didn't even know how to spell her own name. Not that she intended to use book smarts to get ahead. Kathy knew where her destiny lay, at the abattoir, and she couldn't wait to get started. She got her first job at the slaughterhouse at 16, working to clean carcasses and cut them into smaller pieces. Eventually, she became a boner and was well known for her knife skills. She took great pride in her set of knives, something all the abattoir workers owned. She loved them. They were her most prized possessions, and she let no one else touch them. Not even her boyfriend, David Kellett, who she met at work. Exactly when the pair became an item is unclear, but the romance moved at a clip. Kellett fell for the tall redhead who liked to fish and wasn't afraid to throw hands if things got rowdy at the pub. She was the kind of girl who loved to hunt and took delight in the trophies that came from it. Cowhides, skulls, horns, all of it was stunning decor to young Katherine. And as someone who particularly enjoyed his work on the abattoir's killing floor, Kellett was charmed by Katherine's fearlessness. Even if she was at least a foot taller than him, when it came to love, size didn't matter. As for love making, the teenage lovers reportedly had an insatiable sex drive. According to Kellett, he and Katherine sometimes went at it 10 times a day when they first started dating. Wherever they were, if they could find a little privacy, they took full advantage of it. In short, Katherine couldn't be happier. She had a job she loved and a man who fulfilled her notions of romance. There was only one thing that could make her life even better. One day at work, 18-year-old Katherine found Kellett in the break room. She decided that marrying him was the logical next step, and she wasn't content to sit around and wait for him to come to that conclusion as well. So there, just feet from where animals were slaughtered and cut into meat, Katherine proposed to Kellett. Whether he loved her or not, Kellett couldn't turn Kathy down. She knew how to look after him, and she was the best sex he'd ever had. He'd be a fool to say no. So the couple wed in 1974 in a slapdash courthouse ceremony. The bride wore pink, while her hungover groom donned purple paisley. Then, once they said "I do," the newlyweds strolled across the road to the neighborhood pub for an afternoon of drinking with friends and family. But the happy day wasn't all wine and roses. At one stage, Barbara pulled Kellett aside to give him a stern warning. She told him to be careful with Katherine, to never cheat on her. She said, "You better watch this one. She'll kill ya." Unfortunately, like so many warnings about Katherine Knight, it seemed to go ignored, and the consequences were disastrous. Up next, Katherine shows her new husband her true colors. In 1974, Katherine Knight joined David Kellett in blissful matrimony. After spending their wedding day with their loved ones at the Aberdeen pub, the happy couple went home to celebrate in private. According to Kellett, he and the missus made love 3 times that night, a fitting tribute to their blossoming relationship. 18-year-old Katherine wasn't quite so impressed. Kellett later said she woke him up hours later, her hands around his throat, choking him in her rage. 3 times wasn't enough, she told him. Her parents had sex 5 times on their wedding night, which meant that already her new husband was letting her down. She wasn't getting what she deserved from this man. Men, they were everything her mother said they'd be. Of course, Katherine had grown up in a house where sex was given when demanded, so her perspective on consent and stamina was skewed. And whether Kellett was up for another 2 times after a day of drinking is unclear. It's possible he convinced Kath to simply round up in her mind if she was so concerned with the numbers. But given what we know about her, that seems unlikely. And unfortunately, Katherine's erratic behavior was just beginning. Now that she'd married Kellett, she seemed to feel no need to curb her worst impulses, airing them out like damp laundry. Which, by the way, had to be hung out in a very specific way. You see, Katherine didn't want her underwear displayed on the outside of the clothesline for all of Aberdeen to see, and if Kellett got it wrong, she would fly into a screaming, violent rage. It was one of countless petty upsets that infuriated Katherine, many of which seemed to originate with her mother. Mothers-in-law can be a headache in even the best marriages, but Barbara Knight's influence dominated her daughter's new union. Her word was law, and her relationship and housekeeping advice to Katherine was sacrosanct. If there was a silver lining to Kathy's terrifying abusive outbursts, it was that they seemed to fade as quickly as they arrived. It was a cycle typical of so many abusive relationships. And when things blew over, Kellett knew there'd be small gifts to say sorry, a six-pack of beer, some chocolate, or a particularly enthusiastic approach to their lovemaking. That was the side of Kath that Kellett remembered when she hit him, the sweetness she'd show with a thoughtful surprise, or the way she took care of him. Perhaps that's why he never hit back and simply put up with the abuse. The thing was, if he hadn't endured and instead insisted that his wife get help for her anger issues, there's a chance her borderline personality disorder would have been identified. The Australian BPD Foundation points out that if it's diagnosed early, the condition is treatable. Frustratingly, no one seemed to think Katherine's violent temper and quick-change mood swings were anything to be concerned about. What she really needed in her life, she decided, was a child. So about a year into their marriage, she and Kellett decided to start a family. She was 20 when she got pregnant. And about 4 months in, Kellett started cheating on her. It was something his mother-in-law had specifically warned him not to do. Luckily for him, Kath remained in the dark about his dalliances, and in May of 1976, their daughter Melissa arrived. Strangely, a newborn baby at home just wasn't the incentive Kellett needed to keep it in his pants, and he continued stepping out on his wife. Eventually, she grew suspicious of his various unexplained absences, and this contributed to what was already a tense atmosphere at home. In July of that year, an argument broke out. By then, Kath had had enough. She tried to stab her husband with a smashed beer bottle or something. It's one of those stories that's been told so many times and embellished in so many places that the truth behind the trauma has somehow been forgotten. The upshot is that Kellett was done with his marriage, and he plotted his escape. Within weeks, he'd skipped town with his new teenage girlfriend, leaving behind a 2-month-old daughter, a note of explanation, and an inconsolable wife. Katherine was a wreck and took to carrying around her abattoir knives with her everywhere she went. If that wasn't concerning enough, the new mother repeatedly threatened to kill her daughter, reportedly blaming the infant for her husband's departure. As such, she seemed intent on doing harm to the little girl, and some stories say she swung her around by the ankles. As for herself, Kath was running on empty and threatened suicide. It was clear she needed help. Eventually, someone brought Katherine to a psychiatric hospital in the town of Tamworth, nearly 2 hours away, where she was deemed a danger to herself and others. And at last she was going to get the professional attention she needed. But for only 2 weeks. She was placed on a course of antidepressants and then discharged from the hospital. Of course, things didn't go so well after that. On August 3rd, Kath walked through Aberdeen, clearly in intense mental anguish. She was wailing in the street and throwing her baby's pram from side to side. At one stage, she reportedly left young Melissa lying on the train tracks that cut through the town, not long before a southbound rattler was due to pass through. After that, she seized an axe from a nearby front yard and brandished it as she ran around the little town. Thankfully, no one was hurt in her terrifying rampage. A man found Melissa before the train came through, and a police constable arrived on the scene to talk Katherine down. Once she was placated, he escorted her back to the hospital in Tamworth, where she told doctors that she'd do it all again, only with a knife the next time. So with that in mind, they discharged her that same night, and I think you can probably see where this is going. A couple of days later, Katherine showed up at a neighbor's house, seemingly frantic because her daughter was sick and she needed a ride to the doctor. The woman's teenage daughter, who we'll call Sharon, followed Kath inside to help her bring Melissa out to the car, but quickly realized that something was very, very wrong. Katherine bent over the bassinet for a moment, then pulled a knife from beneath the blankets and charged at the teenager. And here's where the details of the story get somewhat fuzzy. We know that Kath chased Sharon outside and then kept the entire neighbor family hostage for about an hour. Eventually, she calmed down enough to carry out the rest of her plan. Katherine climbed into the neighbor's car with them, now fixated on chasing down her deserting husband. Unfortunately for her, the vehicle was running low on fuel, so they had to pull into a petrol station just a short way down the road. That's when Sharon and her family seized their chance and ran inside, locking themselves in the station's small office. In response, Katherine's temper flared again, and she smashed a window to try and get at her escaped prisoners. By the time police arrived on the scene, she had one of the children held at knife point, but the two officers convinced her to let him go. Then both cops each picked up a broom and held them out while walking towards Katherine, keeping the makeshift weapons in front in case the volatile young mother made any sudden movements. But Katherine was done. The fight had gone out of her, the rage replaced with despair once more. She was taken into custody and brought to a psychiatric hospital in Morissette, about an hour and a half away. Thankfully, the doctors at Morissette decided Katherine needed extra care and kept her at the facility. One doctor wrote, quote, "The girl has little insight into herself. She acts impulsively and violently when roused. She is both immature and intellectually unstable and seems to have little awareness of the consequences which might result from her irrational behavior." This analysis likely came after Katherine told staff that she blamed her daughter for Kellett's departure and that her recent violent outbursts were an attempt to get her hands on her mother-in-law and demand an explanation for what happened. Luckily for her, she wouldn't have to go looking for Kellett's mother again. She came to Katherine, and she brought a special guest. By this stage, Kellett's relationship with his teenage girlfriend had soured, and he came home, tail between his legs. When he heard where his wife was, he and his mother, who we'll call Lorraine, paid Katherine a visit. And without blinking, Katherine told Lorraine how she'd planned on killing her before the cops brought her in. Naturally, the hospital allowed Katherine to be released into Lorraine's care, so she and Kellett could give their marriage another go. With her husband back at last, Katherine seemed on top of the world. Nothing would come between them, not even her own family. The Knights had been looking after 3-month-old Melissa while Katherine was in the hospital, and when the reunited couple stopped by to collect her, Barbara attacked her son-in-law. Displaying a temper much like her troubled daughter, she wrapped her hands around his neck and started to choke him. Katherine wasn't having that. She drew back her arm and punched her mother in the head, knocking her to the ground and ordering her to leave her man alone. After that, the seemingly repaired young family unit moved north to Queensland, where Kellett got a job driving trucks, and Katherine found work in an abattoir near the city of Brisbane. This meant more work for her beloved knives, which she decided to hang on a set of hooks above her bed. Why? Just in case she needed them in the bedroom, or if there was occasion to kill somebody. Surprisingly, the implicit threat of deadly weapons dangling above their heads as they slept didn't improve the marriage. Katherine quickly became her old, jealous, moody self, swinging between the extremes of passionate woman who couldn't get enough of her husband to a vengeful, suspicious partner. One night, Katherine ordered Kellett to leave a darts tournament at the local pub. She didn't want him out that late. But he ignored her and kept playing until the end of the competition. When he got home, Katherine was waiting for him. As soon as Kellett walked in the door, she hit him in the head with something heavy, sending him back into the night, running for cover. He spent the next week in the hospital, and when he got home, it turned out Katherine had burned all of his clothes. But by then, she was sorry and bought him a new wardrobe to prove it. Her swinging moods were frustrating and frightening. Unfortunately, Katherine was pregnant again, and Kellett didn't feel like he could abandon his child. Not again, anyhow. He was trapped. So for the next few years, the marriage persisted, chugging along despite the friction. And though their story was almost played out, there were still moments of terrifying abuse from Katherine, directed at the entire family. According to Kellett's sister, she once saw Katherine washing young Melissa's hair with water that was scalding hot, eliciting screams from the little girl. Other infractions were less remarkable, but no less frightening. Mugs and cups thrown across the room, either at walls or loved ones, it made no difference. The sound of shattering ceramics punctuated Kath's moods just the same. But perhaps the most frightening incident occurred after a brief separation. Kellett woke one night feeling his wife's weight completely on him and the heart-stopping pressure of a sharp blade held against his throat. Kath was straddling her husband, and she had an important question to ask him. She looked into his eyes and wondered if it was true that truck drivers had a woman in every town. It would be only too easy to kill him right then, she said. A simple flick of the wrist, and his blood would gush forth like an animal in the slaughterhouse. In an ordinary story, this might be the final straw. You'd expect Kellett to run for his life. But he didn't. He stayed. And in the end, it was Katherine who called an end to the marriage. Once again, she suspected him of cheating on her. So while he was at work, she emptied their house, taking every stick of furniture, leaving him 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 saucers, and a couch. Just the necessities for her unfaithful husband and his side piece, she figured. It was 1983 by the time 28-year-old Katherine Knight finally rolled back into her hometown of Aberdeen. 8 years since she'd been taken to Morissette's mental hospital. She moved in with her parents again, back into the abusive home where she'd grown up, and went back to her old job at the abattoir, where her love affair with her knives began. It was easy to slip back into her old life. Yes, her father beat her, and yes, people in town probably talked about her behind her back, but Kath let it all wash over her like the tide. The next couple of years were marked mostly by a few injuries at work, which brought with them enjoyable and profitable time off, but frustrating back pain. Eventually, Katherine and her daughters moved into their own home. She dabbled in some relationships, but they always seemed to end when the man displayed pedophilic impulses towards the young girls. At least, that's what Kath maintained. She was protecting them from the dangers of these repulsive men, she said, even if no one else saw what she did. But in 1986, a new lover entered the picture who would leave a lasting impression. Like her volatile marriage, this new relationship would be passionate, and just like before, it would spill blood. Katherine gets even more violent next. Now back to our story. 30-year-old Katherine Knight was ready to love again. Now back in her hometown of Aberdeen, New South Wales, the mother of 2 already had one husband in her past. But despite her continuing distrust of men, Kath was never one to stay off the horse for long. And in 1986, another steed caught her eye. David Saunders was a panel beater in his late 30s who also spent time working at the mines near Aberdeen. According to those who knew him at the time, his one vice was that he liked his drink, which kept him at the local pub longer than most. Not long after he and Kath met, Saunders moved from his home in the next town over and into Kath's Aberdeen home, bringing his beloved dingo pup with him. That's another thing you should know about Saunders. He loved dogs. Everyone knew that. But before they had much time to acclimate as a new family unit, tragedy struck the Knight clan. One day in December, Katherine got a phone call telling her that her mother was sick and that she should come over. She did as she was told, but by the time she made it to the Knight homestead, Barbara Knight was already dead. Katherine was inconsolable and angry with her father, whom she blamed for the unexpected death. By the next day, Katherine was so upset she had to be sedated. It's possible this was her new beau's first glimpse at Katherine's intense emotional range. If it was, it probably didn't raise any flags, not when she was mourning her mother's passing. But Saunders' patience only lasted so long. About a month later, the relationship soured, and he retreated to Scone, unable to put up with her frightening moods and general instability. Of course, that wasn't the end of things. No, Katherine followed her man up the motorway to confront him. As was a running theme with most of her partners, she accused him of sleeping around and told him that she was pregnant, while beating him as best she could. But Katherine wasn't done. She seized a knife from the kitchen, and for a moment she considered what to do with it. She could rush at him, cut him for cheating on her, for knocking her up and leaving her, or she could hit him where she knew he would feel it most. Before Saunders could stop her, she ran outside and picked up his dingo puppy. She didn't hesitate, just killed the animal with one blow. By the time Saunders had caught up, the dog was dead, and Katherine felt her anger receding. He took one look at the blood and fled, bolting out the front door and into a neighbor's home. Unfortunately, this wasn't the first instance of animal cruelty from Katherine. According to those who knew her, Kath liked to swerve to hit cats or dogs if she saw them in the street. She'd also reportedly threatened to slit the throats of a neighbor's dogs when they wouldn't stop barking one day. But the murder of Saunders' dog feels different. For years, Kath used various abuse tactics to dominate her partners and keep them close. And by killing the dog, she showed that nothing was off limits to her. She wanted things her way, and she'd do whatever it took to get it. Various studies have shown links between domestic abuse and violence towards pets, and have demonstrated that it's a tool abusers use to control their partners. This kind of emotional violence is a tactic often employed by women who abuse their partners, as opposed to physical violence. Though in this case, it's possible Kath decided that her usual physical abuse hadn't done the trick, so it was time to try something new. And she wasn't done playing her cards. Later that night, Katherine visited the nearest hospital in Scone, claiming that Saunders had beaten her, had kicked her in the stomach. Her, a pregnant woman. But of course, Kath wasn't pregnant, nor did it seem like she'd been hit at all. There was a graze on her lip and a small bump on the back of her head. The doctors sent her away with aspirin and orders to come back in the morning. Well, that wasn't nearly dramatic enough for Katherine, so she visited another doctor's office just hours later to make the same claims. Only this time, she had lacerations on her forehead and lip and a bruised arm to help sell her story. While we can't be certain what happened in between the two visits, it certainly seems that she had gone out of her way to make sure her story was believable this time. She had to make her boyfriend the bad guy. Despite all this, Saunders gave Katherine another chance, but the episode had set a disturbing, if not familiar, pattern for their turbulent relationship. Violent mood swings, threats of self-harm, and even one suicide attempt. Saunders stuck around through it all. Just like Kellett before him, Saunders couldn't shake himself loose, and Kath seemed loath to let him go. His paychecks were great, and that meant she didn't have to work much. In fact, her back injury prevented her from doing so after 1986. It didn't stop her from other strenuous activities, though, and she eventually became pregnant. The pair welcomed a daughter in 1988, even though that didn't slow down the familiar, abusive, manipulative cycle that was their relationship. Whenever Saunders left, and he did from time to time, Kath was sure to follow him around town, showing up wherever he was, waiting for the moment of weakness she knew was coming. And those moments always came. Mostly, Saunders explained to a friend, because Katherine was so good in bed, she was irresistible. Though he could have done without her abuse, like the time she stabbed him with a pair of scissors, or the day she hit him in the head with a hot iron because he stayed too long at the pub. And though most reports indicate that Katherine was the violent one, she reported him to the police multiple times, claiming that he was an abusive drunk. Now, to be clear, we don't want to discount Katherine's side of the story. However, both of Saunders' other wives swore that he was never violent with them. Conversely, we know Katherine had a history of inflicting domestic abuse on her partners, so it's difficult to believe that her version of events is the more accurate, especially because we know that when the abuse eventually got to be too much for Saunders to handle, he fled. He hid out in the city of Newcastle for months while telling Kath he was in Tottenham, about 5 hours away. He didn't intend to return to Aberdeen. Luckily, Kath could have competed for Australia at the Olympics of moving on. Her next tango partner was a man named John Chillingworth, who she met at a pub in Scone in 1990. Around a month after she met him, Katherine was pregnant, and she wasted no time registering the unborn child under John's name so she could claim support. Then she spent the pregnancy taunting him, claiming that maybe the baby was his and maybe it wasn't. It was a cruel tactic, possibly born of Kath's own uncertainty about the child's paternity. Either way, it was incredibly effective. John Chillingworth was wrapped around her little finger. But as far as we can tell, she was never physically abusive towards him. This might be because he was bigger than she, which wasn't always the case in her partners. Without a size advantage, perhaps she didn't fancy her odds. Still, she accused John of abusing her and her children, though confirmed records of this abuse are elusive. Luckily for John, he got off fairly light. Katherine ended things around October 1993 and cut off access to their son. She'd lost interest in John Chillingworth, and he had to continue supporting their child financially, so there was no use keeping him around, not when she set her sights on someone new. That shiny new beau was 38-year-old John Price. At 5'6", he was shorter than Katherine, which might have been what made her say yes when he asked her to dance at the pub that night. He'd no doubt be much easier to loom over than her last man. His below-average height wasn't the only thing Price had in common with Kath's exes. He also loved his drink and spent a lot of time at the pub. Though, to be fair, in a town as small as Aberdeen, what else was a bloke supposed to do? Though he may have overindulged on occasion, those who knew him also said he was kind-hearted and generous. Divorced, he reportedly still loved his ex-wife Colleen and seemed to harbor hopes that she'd return to him one day. In fact, he still lived in the house he'd built with her and kept it exactly as she'd left it. It was her house, he told people. The poor guy was lovesick. But for now, there was Katherine Knight. With her red hair and tempestuous nature, she might have seemed an exciting change of pace for Price. By the end of 1993, they'd tumbled into a relationship with all the hallmarks of Kath's earlier dalliances: mood swings, passionate sex, startling abuse. But they were in it now, and neither made any moves to break things off. They might have, though, if they could see what was coming. What neither one of them knew at the start was that only one of them would get out of the relationship alive. It's often said that there's a thin line between love and hate, and no one knew that better than Katherine Knight. She lived her life dancing from one side of that line to the other, rarely staying in one place for long, emotionally speaking. On one side, there were thoughtful gifts and passionate sex. On the other, violent abuse, screaming tirades, and streaks of violence. But eventually, it seemed Kath had enough, and when she reached the end of her rope, she found herself left on the less romantic side of things, and this time her partner wasn't getting away as easily as the others. She'd have her pound of flesh out of this one. She'd have it all. Welcome to Female Criminals, a Spotify original from Parcast. I'm your host, Vanessa Richardson, and today we're wrapping up the story of Katherine Knight. Last week, we watched Kath grow up in the small town of Aberdeen, leaving a trail of abused partners in her wake. Today, we'll learn about Katherine's shocking crime, her dubious plan to get away with it, and explore the impact she had on Australia as a whole. We've got all that and more coming up. Stay with us. By the beginning of 1994, 38-year-old Katherine Knight was in a relationship once again. She'd met her new boyfriend, John Price, at the local pub one night, and things moved pretty quickly from there. They spent most nights at John's house, practically living together. Now, I know that when you hear that, you're probably thinking about an explosion of romantic passion, or perhaps even a shotgun wedding. But there likely wasn't much traditional romance blossoming between the two. Of course, we have to keep in mind Katherine's relationship history, namely that she was reportedly abusive, physically and psychologically, to each of her earlier partners. It's likely that this new relationship got serious so fast because of Kath's possessive nature, rather than any genuine notions of love. And as for a wedding, well, that seemed unlikely from the jump, mostly because 38-year-old Price was still legally married to his ex-wife, Colleen. She'd left him about 6 years earlier, but according to Peter Lawler in his book Bloodstain, Price never really got over Colleen. To wit, there was apparently never any animosity between the two. He deposited money into her bank account when he knew she was going on holiday and bought her a brand new fridge when she told him she was looking at buying one second-hand. In short, he wanted her to be happy, even if it wasn't with him. It was likely the memories of how happy he'd been with Colleen that drove Price to maintain their marital home exactly as she'd left it when she walked out. The curtains didn't change, the furniture stayed as they had been, even his wardrobe looked untouched, just a little emptier. And though Kath wanted to put her stamp on things, reorganizing the kitchen, redecorating the living room, Price put his foot down. It was his house, and it was staying the way he liked it. Besides, Katherine didn't even really live there. As a single mother, she was entitled to more robust welfare payments if she lived alone with her kids than if she moved in with Price officially. So all in all, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this relationship was fated for a quick death. But somehow, Katherine and Price made it work. He seemed content to have a companion who was happy to take care of him, and it was likely that Kath was determined to finally make something stick. Plus, she seemed to genuinely care for Price, at least initially. On their first anniversary, she gave him a card declaring that she loved him with all her heart. You might remember that Kath couldn't really read or write, so finding a card and then putting her own personal message for Price inside it was a mark of just how much she truly cared for him. Before we continue with Katherine's psychology, please keep in mind that I'm not a licensed psychiatrist or psychologist, but we have done a lot of research for the show. Last time, we mentioned that Katherine left school when she was around 15, having never learned to read or write. And while we don't know any other specifics about her education, it's possible that she had anxiety about the written word as a result. In their 2010 article, Understanding Reading Anxiety, New Insights from Neuroscience, Doctors Mary Rank-Yalongo and Rayanne Hirsch point out that children who never learn to read might actually have a fear of doing so. Looking at research from multiple sources, Yalongo and Hirsch explain how a child struggling to read might experience anxiety in the classroom setting, based on their own interpretation of how their peers and teacher react. by repeatedly pairing a seemingly innocuous stimulus, like being asked to read aloud, with this perceived negativity, the two ideas become linked. Again, we can't be certain that this is how Katherine felt about reading, and if this cycle contributed to her illiteracy. But if it did, it could offer some insight into the scope of her feelings for John Price, that she willingly sought out a token of affection that required her to read and write. And for a while, that spark of romance was enough to carry the couple through. No longer tied to her job at the local abattoir, Katherine settled into the role of doting grandmother to Price's grandchildren. In recent years, she'd started taking sewing classes and found she loved making clothes for the little ones. That said, being with her family was one of the few options Kath had left when it came to spending her time. She didn't have many friends in Aberdeen, and that's not exactly surprising. Everyone in town knew it was best to steer clear of Katherine Knight, because while she could be affectionate and loving when it suited her, she also experienced uncontrollable bouts of rage. In one story, Kath's eldest daughter, Melissa, was drinking at the local pub one afternoon. Without warning, Katherine showed up absolutely fuming. Just what provoked this fury is unclear, though it's possible the teenager wasn't yet 18 and her mother didn't want her drinking underage. Whatever the case, people said that she marched over to where Melissa was enjoying her drink and smashed the teenager's head into the bar, then shoved her to the ground. Eventually, she dragged Melissa across the floor of the bar by her hair and led her out to the parking lot. There, she beat the girl's head into the side of a van, then pushed her in and drove away. Through it all, the rest of the pub's patrons watched in fear, too scared to intervene. Kath's reputation had them rooted to the spot. In his book about Katherine, Peter Lawler notes that Melissa denied the event ever happened and claimed it was one of those stories that seems to emerge fully formed in small towns. But even if that's the case, it's still a clear indication of the kind of violent behavior people expected and believed of Kath. But it seems the stories about Kath's violent temper didn't dissuade Price from continuing their relationship, and now that she had him ensnared, Kath had no intention of letting Price go. One night in March of 1995, she apparently tried to get him to commit to the relationship more seriously. To be fair, they had been together for about 18 months by that stage, so it wasn't an unreasonable request. But Price wasn't interested in offering more commitment. He told Kath that he was just in it for the fun, and that she could like it or lump it. Well, as you can imagine, Kath didn't appreciate just about anything her boyfriend had just said to her. In her position, another person might have cut their losses and called it quits. Not her. You see, Kath had had a few drinks that night, and so her judgment was, let's say, clouded. So she went home, swallowed a handful of pills, and instructed her teenage daughter, Natasha, not to call the ambulance. Whether she truly meant to complete suicide that night, we'll never know, but she was rushed to the hospital and back home by the next day. And after all that, she was still determined to hold on to Price. By now, their relationship had settled into an uneasy pattern. It seemed he was over the drama and her moods, but she refused to withdraw her claws. Whether or not she truly loved him is up for debate, but Kath wanted him to finally divorce Colleen and marry her, and he clearly had no interest in doing either. But Katherine was tenacious, and the couple eventually started telling people they were engaged. Though when Kath wasn't listening, Price told friends that he'd only agreed to the arrangement to keep the peace. He explained to his bewildered mates that Kath had simply bought herself a ring with his money. It's possible that wasn't the only thing Kath bought with Price's money, even if it was the most metaphorically resonant. Besides, access to Price's wallet was certainly a perk of the relationship. In fact, it might have been a big factor in why she was so keen to hold on to him. His job at the nearby mine paid very well, and it seems she saw dollar signs when she looked at him. That greed eventually colored her once rosy outlook on the relationship, and in 1997, when he again told her he wanted her out, she said she'd go for $10,000. It felt fair to her, an equitable exchange that was no less than she was due. But as much as Price wanted Katherine out of his life, he wasn't going to pay her. He even made a point of telling her that she'd get nothing out of him. He'd written his will so that his children inherited the house when he died, perhaps because he knew she wanted it. Hearing this, Kath was furious. She'd invested almost 3 years of her life into this relationship, and he expected her to leave it empty-handed? It was typical. John Price was a waste of her time and energy, just like all the rest of the men she'd been with, and she'd made every one of them pay. They got what was coming to them in the end. She'd cut them off from their kids, run them out of town, even killed a beloved dog. And Price? He was going to get what he deserved. She'd make sure of that. Coming up, Katherine gets her vengeance, and then some. Sometime in 1997, 41-year-old Katherine Knight finally decided to leave her boyfriend, John Price. Theirs had never been a particularly happy relationship, but Kath still felt like he owed her something at the end of it. After all, he had plenty of money and a nice little house. She deserved something of his. But when Price told her he wasn't paying her a thing, Kath saw red. Then she made a plan. Price would pay all right. One day when Price left for work at the local mine, Katherine waved him off from the kitchen. She smiled at his disappearing truck, never letting on that she was calling it on their so-called romance. While he was at work, Kath rushed around Price's home, gathering up every one of her belongings and packing them, ready to take them back to her own house just around the corner. Then she pulled out a video camera and took careful footage of some key pieces around the place, all things Price had stolen from the mine. Then she sent one copy of the footage to the local police station and another to his employers. As far as spiteful acts go, it seemed somewhat tame for Kath, who'd shown just how violent she could be in the past. But the videotape had a disastrous effect on Price's life. He was fired from his job, losing his sizable income, the long service leave he'd accumulated over the years, and his retirement fund, all in one fell swoop. And there's no way he didn't know who was responsible. It was a calculated, devastating parting shot from Kath, the kind of scorched earth move that should have left Price furious and unforgiving. But for some reason, it didn't. Eventually, he landed a new job, but ended up with the same girlfriend. Just weeks later, the pair were back together, and this time, Kath made it clear that she wasn't messing around. She told Price that this time they were in it until death, and she meant it. For at least the next year or so, the relationship, such as it was, carried on without any major dramas, at least none that were out of the ordinary for the couple. But sometime in the spring of 1999, Kath stabbed Price in the chest, and while he survived the incident, it left him rattled. He called friends in tears, telling them that he was scared for his life and for his teenage children. But Kath did her best to get ahead of the story. She visited her lawyer and the local police, telling all manner of stories to explain away the stabbing. She didn't realize she was holding a knife. She was only pointing it at him. She tripped. She wasn't wearing her glasses. And besides, she said, it was all his fault anyway. It was more of the same from the violent woman who still wasn't over Price's refusal to give her his house. Now, years into their dance, she'd seemingly fallen out of love with him, just like all the rest. But she'd be damned if she was going to go through another breakup, not when there were other options available to her. Towards the end of 1999, Katherine told her brother Charlie that she was going to kill Price. As simple as that, like she decided to change her hair color. If she couldn't have him, and it certainly seemed she couldn't, not really, then no one could. And she'd get away with it, she explained, by pretending to be insane. Of course, this declaration was somewhat alarming to Charlie, but he waved it off. His sister had claimed she was going to kill John Price several times before that, and clearly she hadn't yet. So what was there to worry about? Dear listener, there was so much to worry about. At the end of February 2000, an argument broke out, and it turned violent quickly. When police arrived to break things up, Kath tried to play things down. Yes, they'd grabbed each other by the throat, she admitted, but now that Price had let off some steam, there was no need to worry. She rejected their suggestion that she spend the night at her own house. She'd never admit it to the police, but to do so would be to cede ground to her enemy. She couldn't let him have any kind of victory. She couldn't let him feel like he'd won. In the end, police prepared apprehended violence orders against both Kath and Price. Not quite a restraining order. AVOs are typically used in Australia for cases of domestic violence. It's essentially a court order that forbids the use of threats or violence against whoever filed the application, with room for further restrictions and penalties if it's breached. In this case, the police made applications on behalf of both Kath and Price, but only Kath's was filed. Court officials decided that, based on their experience, it was usually the woman who needed protection, so the order against Kath was essentially forgotten about. So it was John Price who was served with a court summons the next day, not his abusive partner. But rather than get angry, he asked for help. While Katherine watched on suspiciously, he led the police officers into another room so he could speak in private. He wanted Kath out, he said, but the cops said there was nothing they could do. If he wanted her to leave, it was a problem for the courts. Of course, not knowing what Price said to the police made Katherine furious. She wondered whether they were conspiring against her. She wouldn't allow him to tell lies about her, she resolved. She wouldn't be thrown out, left behind, discarded. Not again. It was time to act. That night, she pondered her plan while John slept beside her, and she wondered, should she do it now? It would be so easy. He was asleep, helpless. She slipped out from under the covers and moved to stand at the foot of the bed, waiting, deciding. That's where Price saw her when he startled awake in the early hours of February 29th. She was staring at him, her arms tucked behind her back, concealing a knife, perhaps? He didn't know, but the image terrified him. At work just hours later, Price told some of his colleagues what had happened. It was clear to everyone that he was genuinely terrified of his partner, so they encouraged him to take the day off and go to the courthouse right away. Unfortunately, because the AVO against him had already been filed, Price couldn't take one out against Kath. He'd have to wait 3 weeks, the clerk told him. Desperate, Price lifted his shirt and showed the clerk the stab wound Katherine gave him months earlier, but the official's hands were tied. Price was on his own. Not knowing where else to go, he spent the afternoon at the pub, downing beers and turning down offers of a place to crash. He figured he had to draw the line somewhere, and he wouldn't let Katherine drive him from his own home. Price's hesitation to accept material help from concerned friends, and the fact that his request to file an AVO against Kath was denied, reflects a troubling trend in cases of partner violence. In 2014, psychologist Zlatka Rakovets-Felser published a report on domestic abuse and violence. The report looked at the kinds of violence that might go unnoticed and what factors contribute to that. Dr. Rakovets-Felser noted that in cases where women are injured by a male partner, the man is charged 91.1% of the time. But when the roles are reversed, the female abuser is charged in only 60.2% of cases. Exploring the disparity, Dr. Rakovets-Felser cites a 2007 study theorizing that because men are socialized to be strong providers for women and children, they can have difficulty expressing their emotions, including fear of their abusive partner. Which of these things was in play for John Price, we can't say for sure, but it was clear that he was having a bad time of it, and no one quite knew how to help him. Meanwhile, Katherine was focused on her own problems, such as they were. She spent the day visiting the few friends she had, as well as the local police, telling anyone who would listen about how Price had assaulted her. Then, that night, she spent time with her children and granddaughter, enjoying dinner at the local Chinese restaurant and documenting the night on a video camera. It was a little after midnight when Kath walked from her house to Price's. Inside, she slipped into something a little more comfortable, a sexy black nightie she'd bought that same day. It was a special occasion after all, and despite what she planned to do after, Katherine was determined to have sex with John Price one more time. He was never able to resist her in bed. None of them were. So she seduced her battered partner one last time. And then, well, Katherine insists that her memories stopped there. The next thing she remembered was waking up in the hospital. Anything else, she said, she didn't know. But we know. Though it doesn't seem like Kath ever gave a full account of what happened next to police, various sources help us put things together. The following is based on court records and Peter Lawler's book, Bloodstain. It started in the bedroom, right in the bed, with the handle of her best boning knife wrapped in her fist. Kath plunged the blade into Price. It wasn't the first time she'd stabbed him. It wouldn't be the last. Terrified, 44-year-old Price pulled himself free of the sheets and rushed to the door. He fumbled for the light switch, leaving blood on the walls as Kath gave chase, stabbing him again and again. Eventually, he stumbled out of the bedroom and made a last desperate dash for the front door. But Katherine had no intention of letting Price get outside. He was so attached to this house that he refused to give it to her. Well, she'd make sure he'd never leave. She chased him, painting the hallway with his blood with every stab and slash of her knife. Even riddled with dozens of stab wounds, Price wrested open the front door, so close to freedom. But he barely got a hand on the doorway before Kath dragged him back in. Either that or he inexplicably stumbled back indoors. And that's where John Price died, just inside his own front door. Katherine Price just kept stabbing until the man she'd once written her only love letter to was dead in a pool of his own blood. But Katherine's night was just getting started. With Price dead on the floor, she got in the shower to clean off the blood. Then, perhaps feeling like she deserved a reward for her hard work, she pulled the bank card from her late partner's wallet and drove to the nearest ATM, which, when the pub was closed, was in the next town over. There, she withdrew $1,000 before heading back to Price's home to start the real work. Not that it was a chore she didn't relish. Kath had always loved her work at the abattoir, and tonight she wanted to relive that glory. She also wanted to claim a trophy from her hard-won kill. Absent majestic horns, John Price offered up only one option. Kath grabbed one of her sharpest knives and slowly, meticulously, she skinned Price's rapidly cooling body. When she was done, she held aloft a horrifying human pelt, which she hung from a meat hook in the doorway to the kitchen. Perhaps she wanted Price's ghostly shape to watch what she did next. Because although she'd never been a great cook, Katherine had a feast to prepare, and the first step of that was to separate Price's head from his body, which she did with expert precision. Then she placed it into a large pot on the stove, surrounded by peeled and chopped vegetables. While that cooked, she sliced several steaks from Price's buttocks. She placed 2 of these on a baking tray in the oven. Then, to complete the meal, she whipped up some gravy. No one likes a dry cut of meat. When it was all finished, Katherine served up her Lecter-like feast on 2 plates, one for each of Price's children to find. By then, dawn was getting closer, but there wasn't much else to be done. She cleaned herself up a little, smashed some of Price's family photos, and retired to the bedroom where it all began. There, she swallowed a handful of pills, antihistamines and blood pressure medication, and lay down on the bed. She knew someone would find her eventually, soon probably, but she'd be ready for them. The game wasn't over yet. Coming up, Katherine Knight's final desperate move. Now we finish our story. In the eerie early hours of March 1st, 2000, 44-year-old Katherine Knight murdered her partner, John Price. Then, like something from the worst slasher film, she skinned and decapitated her lover's body and cooked parts of him in his own kitchen. And just like the killer in a movie, Kath expected to get away with her crime. But to do that, she had to be patient and wait for someone to notice Price was dead. Luckily for her, that didn't take long. A likable friend and punctual colleague, Price's absence at work was noticed quickly that morning. And after what he'd told people about Kath, alarm bells started ringing almost immediately, as did Price's phone, but there was no answer. Still, Price's neighbor Anthony could see that his friend's truck was in the driveway, which meant he had to be home. So when the calls continued to go unanswered, he crossed the street to get a closer look. He and Price had shared a few drinks the night before, and perhaps he thought his mate was feeling a little hungover. But John Price didn't come to the door when Anthony knocked. He didn't come when Anthony called out his name, and that's when Anthony noticed it. Blood on the door handle. Now even more worried, he walked over to Price's bedroom window and tapped softly on the glass, hoping that might wake his missing friend. Then, when it didn't, he banged louder. By this stage, word was spreading that Price was missing. Friends and colleagues all over Aberdeen called each other, hoping they'd find him. But of course, no one had seen him. So eventually, the police were called. It was around 8:15 that morning when a pair of cop cars pulled up to Price's usually quiet street. Concerned neighbors gathered, drawing closer to the brick house. They were eager for information, even if they felt sure that the news wasn't going to be good. The officers took a lap around the house, peering in one of the windows. It was dim inside, but light enough for them to spot a strange shape hanging in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen. Eventually, someone grabbed a crowbar from the back of Price's ute, and the cops forced their way in through the laundry door. Then, one by one, they headed into the silent house, while anxious onlookers waited outside. With every passing minute, tensions in the street notched higher. But that was nothing compared to what was going on inside. Most of the curtains were drawn in the house, so the officers had to wait for their eyes to slowly adjust after the bright morning sun. But when they could make out the chaos in front of them, one of the first things they found was John Price's skinned, decapitated corpse. If that wasn't bad enough, they were then confronted with the horrific sight of his lifeless skin hanging on a hook, a vicious slash across its throat, and countless stab wounds scattered over its torso. In the kitchen, the floor was washed with blood, which was also sprayed on countless other surfaces. On the kitchen counter, Katherine's stomach-churning feast waited, with makeshift place cards made out for Price's children. And of course, the disgusting mess left behind by the meal's twisted chef: a head in a pot of stock, a tray of human steaks, a congealing gravy. It was the stuff of nightmares. The police found Kath in the bedroom, asleep under a bedsheet on the floor, and escorted her out of the house. The whole team left. No one wanted to be in there any longer than they had to be. Plus, they knew they needed to preserve the crime scene. Outside, word spread quickly from police to friends and neighbors. John Price was dead, and it looked like Katherine Knight was the killer. But Kath wasn't talking. After taking so many pills, she seemed completely out of it, unaware of just about everything. It seems likely that at least part of that was due to the medication, but you might also remember that Kath once told her brother that she planned to kill Price, and that she'd get away with it by pretending to be insane. Was this part of that very plan? If it wasn't, it seems like one hell of a coincidence. Not that investigators knew that just yet. All they could see was a woman who very clearly murdered her partner, but who also needed medical attention. So while detectives from a few towns over started putting everything together, Kath was bundled into an ambulance and taken to the hospital. When she finally became lucid again, Kath seemed unaware that Price was dead or that she killed him. Conveniently, though, she remembered exactly what medications she overdosed on. Her medical care depended on that, after all. After she was stable, Katherine was transferred to a psychiatric unit in Maitland Hospital, and that's where police came to interview her a few days after the murder. By then, she'd lawyered up, but still claimed to have no memory of the crime. Before the questioning, Kath's lawyer told detectives that they could have only 15 minutes and that her client didn't want to know anything about what happened in Price's house. Well, the detectives managed to wrangle an hour-long interview out of Kath, who told them that the last memory she had before waking up in the hospital was going out to dinner with her family. Whether they bought that or not, the officers told the 44-year-old that she would be charged with John Price's murder. Her response seemed like a calculated objection to the very idea, "But you haven't even told me he's dead yet." Already, Kath didn't like the way things were going. It wasn't working out exactly like she'd planned it. In her mind, the police should have told her that Price was dead so that she could perform her shock and despair, but they skipped over that part and cut right to the arrest. Meanwhile, the media had caught wind of the case. At first, some local papers had printed vague details about the murder and about Price's decapitation, but it seemed no one really knew what happened. But on March 7th, a week after the murder, the Scone Advocate published an accurate account of the crime on their front page, and suddenly the story was everywhere. Of course, Aberdeen locals had been gossiping about the murder all week, swapping stories they'd heard from mates on the police force or whispered details from relatives. But now, an early contender for crime of the century was being discussed on the national stage, in print and on television. While the country discussed her atrocious crime, Katherine Knight was denied bail and taken to prison to await trial. And inside the jail, she seemed to flourish. She had endless time for crafts, enjoyed plenty of attention from her peers, and did work to keep the facility clean. In letters to her family, she told them that she loved it there. And that's where she stayed for over a year, largely without incident. Although there were reports that when another inmate mentioned Price's murder, Kath's temper got the better of her. What that episode looked like, we aren't sure. At a preliminary hearing a month after the murder, prison psychiatrist Dr. Michael Giuffrida declared that while she was technically fit for trial, Kath wasn't guilty because she was in a dissociative state during the murder. However, Dr. Giuffrida's opinion wasn't the only one taken into account. In June of 2000, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Robert Delaforce spent 2 days interviewing Katherine and came to a very different conclusion. He produced a lengthy report on Kath, her life, and her mental state, and suggested that she was living with chronic PTSD, which might have been caused by trauma from her childhood. He also suggested that she lived with borderline personality disorder. Crucially, he also drew the conclusion that not only did Kath know what she was doing the night of the murder, she also knew that it was wrong. He theorized that she might have even enjoyed it. Dr. Giuffrida disagreed with Dr. Delaforce, which led to something of a stalemate. Each side had their expert opinion, which could have led to an interesting courtroom showdown. Except then, Dr. Rod Milton was asked to weigh in. He was renowned in Australia for accurately profiling serial killer Ivan Milat long before he was captured. And unfortunately for Kath, Dr. Milton threw his weight behind the prosecution, discrediting her team's plan to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. He said, quote, "The personality problems demonstrated in the history of Ms. Knight's life are not, in my view, psychiatric diseases. They are her nature. These personality problems did not stop her from knowing what she was doing or whether it was right or wrong, nor did they stop her from exercising control of her actions." Despite this setback, Kath's plan to plead insanity remained unchanged all the way through to the beginning of her trial in October of 2001. Then, on the first day of proceedings, she changed her mind and pleaded guilty. It seems likely that Kath was finally able to see the blood-smeared writing on the wall. She wasn't going to get away with killing John Price. All she could do now was try to mitigate her own sentence. But either she didn't recognize the gravity of her own crime, or she just underestimated everyone else's view of her. During sentencing, the prosecution called the murder of John Price an atrocious and gravely wicked act. And that's probably the gentlest way to describe what Kath did. Justice Barry O'Keefe quite agreed. He pointed out that the last minutes of John Price's life must have been a time of abject terror for him, as they were a time of utter enjoyment for Katherine. As such, he sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the first and only time a woman has ever received that punishment in Australia. Back in Aberdeen, many of the locals likely breathed a sigh of relief at the news. Katherine had cast an outsized shadow on the country town for a good portion of her life, and to know that she wasn't ever going to return must have been a relief. No one wants a convicted murderer living in their community, least of all one whose crime was as twisted as Kath's. And knowing that they were free of that possibility, locals probably tried to forget all about Kath and what happened to John Price. But for some people, the damage was already done. The memories were unshakable. Kath's ex-partners, the ones who survived, the police who discovered her bloody crime scene, Price's relatives left behind. For them, the images were likely too real, too traumatizing to ever let them forget what happened. But around them, Australia moved on. Though cases like the Backpacker murders and the Snowtown murders are seared into the nation's collective memory, something's different with this case. The horror from the small town of Aberdeen, which would seemingly define any other place, is all but forgotten. Just why that is, it's hard to say. Perhaps it's because Kath's a woman, and maybe people find women inherently less frightening than male killers. Or perhaps it's because the truth of her crime was so stomach-churning that few wanted to discuss it. Then again, other women known for their sensationally violent crimes became figures of pop culture repute. People like Lizzie Borden and Eileen Wuornos. Their stories are celebrated in nursery rhymes and puzzled over in Hollywood films and series. So what is it about this tale that invites only stilted discussions in hushed tones? Why are some female criminals turned into revered anti-heroes and others forgotten? Maybe Katherine Knight wasn't young enough, beautiful enough, or from the right town to deserve our lasting attention. Or perhaps it's because in the 20 years since her crime, Kath has largely kept a low profile in prison. Her fellow inmates call her Nana or Grandma, and she teaches people how to crochet. She practices pottery and plays cards, and seems to finally be living a stable life. To this day, Katherine Knight's file is marked never to be released. And when you think about it, maybe that's good for her. Maybe it's what she needs. It's certainly what she deserves.